Okay, good morning everyone. Thank you for joining our training session. My name's Dave. I'm Formpak's Regulatory Manager. I'll be conducting the training today, more than ably assisted by my fantastic co-presenter Cheryl, who's Formpak's Support and Training Manager. So today we're going to be talking about the IFRA IOFI labelling manual and updating your Formpak data with the latest version. So I'll be talking a bit about the labelling manual for anyone who hasn't been introduced to it before, what's changed from last year, how to update the data in Formpak, understanding how the properties work and interact, importing data, updating the composition of the raw materials, what happens if you're a user on the Plus customer model, and I'll wrap up with a conclusion, and there'll be some time for questions. So there are two industry bodies, one for the fragrance industry and one for the flavour industry, IFRA and IOFI respectively, and these are global associations, and fragrance and flavour companies around the globe can join these associations and benefit from being in the gang. And industry experts form the GHS task force, which reviews available data and concludes appropriate GHS classification and transport classification for the benefit of our industries. So GHS classification is the global harmonized system. So this is the it's not legislation, but it's a model of classification authored by the UN, and many regions around the globe have adopted GHS in order to ease trade between areas. It's not completely global and it's not very harmonized sometimes, but it's better than having 200 different systems in countries all around the world. The European adoption of GHS is, of course, CLP, the Classification, Labelling and Packaging Regulation, and GB has its own variant of that since we left Europe. Transport classification is typically also managed by the UN, and that's quite harmonized across the world, obviously, because transport involves moving stuff from one area to another. So the 2023 labelling manual was issued in January 2024 to IFRA IOFI members as a spreadsheet with 3 tabs. It shouldn't be shared with non-members. However, IFRA and IOFI are usually happy to issue the labelling manual to non-members upon request, as long as they comply with the statements in the cover letter. So let's have a quick look at it. Okay, so it has 3 tabs. This is tab 1, and this contains a whole bunch of chemicals used in flavors and fragrances, and it shows the UN GHS classification. I'll talk a bit more later about variants on different GHS adoptions. So this isn't the CLP classification, this isn't the OSHA classification, this is just the GHS classification. There's more data to the right hand side, and we'll perhaps take a look at some of that later. Okay, so tab 2 is very similar. It's for natural complex substances though, so essential oils and extracts, and it has various identifiers, transport, and the GHS classification, the same as tab 1. And then tab 3 shows the components of many of the oils that appear in tab 2. So here we see this one is AB's Alba cone oil, and so we see the components and amount in there and the classification of the component. So in tab 1 of the 2023 labelling manual, there are 1,761 entries, which is a mere 16 fewer than last year. There's 276 natural complex substances, which is 2 fewer than last year. And there's compositions for 255 of the natural complex substances that appear in tab 2. So in tab 1 and tab 2, they have quite similar data. So there are identification numbers to identify the chemical or natural complex substance, names, the GHS data, physical data such as flash point and hydrocarbon content, transport data, and there are change indicators to indicate what's changed since last year's labelling manual. There are footnotes which give additional information for some entries. And in tab 1, there's a new column since last year for physical state. So it says whether the chemical is liquid, gas or solid, except it isn't very clear under what conditions of temperature or pressure these are determined. And obviously there are different grades of many of these things commercially available, and so they might be slightly variable. So in tab 3, which displays the composition of the natural complex substances in tab 2, there are identification numbers to identify the components, the name of the natural complex substance and the components that are in it, percentages of the component. These are only listed above 0.1%, so any components that are in a smaller quantity than that are not listed. And there's GHS data for the components, excluding aspiration data, hazard data, and flammability. So it does show specific target organ toxicity, roots and organs, acute toxicity, LD50s, LC50s, and ATEs, and it displays M factors. There are component classification change indicators in sheet 3, and these only indicate where the component has changed classification since the previous labelling manual. So there's not actually any indicator that displays whether the component amount has changed or whether additional components are added or removed. So we'll talk a bit later about that and its implication. So what's changed since last year? By reviewing the change and composition change indicators, it's possible to see any entries that have changed. So in tab 1, there are 154 X's to indicate that the GHS classification has changed. And there are 8 pluses to indicate that there are additions, 74 transport amendments and 8 transport additions. In tab 2, there are only amendments, no additions, and there are 75 GHS amendments and 15 transport amendments. So it isn't possible to see what last year's labelling manual entry was without reviewing the actual sheet. So it indicates that there's a change, and it displays the new GHS or transport classification, but it doesn't indicate what last year's classification was in this year's sheet. So if you want to see what the change was, you do need to review the last year's 2022 sheet. So we'll have a look at an example of a change. So we see that alpha methyl cinnamaldehyde in sheet 1 has got an X indicator in it, and we see that the entry is aquatic acute 1 H400 and aquatic chronic 3 H412. So if we look at last year's labelling manual, so this is the labelling manual from 2022. So we see here that the classification last year was aquatic acute 2, and there's no aquatic chronic classification listed. So looking in this year's, we see here that we've got aquatic chronic 3 and aquatic acute 1. So to update this data manually, we need to modify the raw material and look in the property group GHS hazards, which is in the property tab. So I'm going to demonstrate modifying methyl cinnamaldehyde now to align it with the latest labeling manual data. Modify raw material. Navigate to the Properties tab, and we want to be looking at GHS hazards. And so here we see that we have the IFRA IOFI Labelling Manual 2022 classification here, and that it's EHA2, Acute Hazard 2, which is in line with what we saw in the 2022 Labelling Manual. So what we need to do is apply EHA1, Aquatic 1, and remove EHA2. So we just click the minus next to EHA2 to remove it, and type EHA1 here, and give that a value of yes. Then we can modify this property to say we've updated it in line with 2023, which was issued in 2024. So calculate now updates many other related properties, including the signal word, pictograms, H codes, P codes, summary properties. Therefore, we only need to add certain properties from the labeling manual, and many of the others get calculated. So we don't need to add all of the signal words, pictograms, H codes, P codes, just the top line hazards. And sometimes with like the acute tox hazards, we might need to add excuse me, LD50 data, LC50 data, ATE, specific target organ toxicity routes and organs, for example, oral route affecting the liver organ, and any M factors there are. and there's a note here to update the reference. So going back to Formpak, I'm going to click calculate now. And we see that EHA1 has now been put up here in line with the rest of the hazards. And we also now have a GHS environment pictogram, which wasn't triggered before. So at this point, I'm just going to mention the GHS poster that's available to download from our website. So this is quite a useful tool. So we can see that previously EHA2 did not have any pictogram, whereas EHA1 has the environmental pictogram. So the calculated property is completely in line with what we're seeing here of displaying the environment pictogram that wasn't previously there. So this GHS poster is available to download from the Formpak Support Centre, and it will prove invaluable in converting the data in the labelling manual into the required Formpak property code. So looking here, where it shows aquatic acute 1 H400, if we have a look on the GHS poster, it's here we see that H400 equates to the Formpak property EHA1, which is what was added, and that aquatic acute 2 H401 converts to EHA2, which was the property that was removed. So regional variants, CLP and OSHA and other GHS regions aren't necessarily represented by the GHS data in the labelling manual. It's just standard UN GHS classifications, and so as such, we don't get a specific regional classification with the direct data. However, if we take a look in Formpak, we can see here that we have ATO5, SS1B, EHA1 as our GHS hazards. If I look at the CLP hazards, which have also been calculated at the same time I hit calculate now, we still have SS1B because that is a CLP hazard. We still have EHA1, that's a CLP hazard, but the ATO5 has disappeared. And that's because if we check our poster, we can see that acute toxicity 5 are GHS only and not CLP. Similarly, if we look at the OSHA GHS hazards, we see that we have SS1B, we don't have acute toxicity 5, and we don't have any environmental hazards displaying there. So this classification difference between UN and CLP and OSHA is calculated automatically in Formpak, and basically it's just excluding the UN hazards which are not relevant to that region. Sometimes, however, there's a slightly different link. So in GHS and in OSHA GHS, both I irritation 2A and I irritation 2B are included, CLP only includes I irritation 2, which is equivalent to the more hazardous I irritation 2A in GHS. So it has the same definition of I irritancy as EDI 2A in GHS. Therefore, any GHS entry of EDI 2B will be ignored in CLP, and a GHS entry of EDI 2A will be automatically converted into EDI 2 in CLP. So this is why it's quite important that these hazards are added in the GHS hazards property group and not directly into the CLP hazards or the OSHA hazards, because it doesn't calculate GHS from CLP, it only calculates CLP from GHS. So any raw materials that have a composition will have their hazard values calculated. So if you wish to apply labelling manual hazards, either they should be applied at the component level, or the properties on the raw material with a composition should be changed to manual before applying or removing them. So it's advisable to avoid dual properties, so where there's a conflict. So for example, it may be that there's a manually applied value of EHC1, but because of the components and their hazard contribution, there might also be a calculated value of EHC2. So it's probably it's good practice to remove one or the other. And there could be different scenarios. Sometimes you might want the calculated value. Sometimes you might have data to suggest that the raw material with the composition may, if it's, for example, a natural complex substance, it may have its own test data to indicate that its hazards are different from the calculated values. It's also important to remember that the labelling manual is only one data source. So it's not legally binding. You don't have to apply the labelling manual classification. It's valuable because it goes some way to aligning our industries together. However, supplier data, REACH registration data, ECHA C&L inventory data also have some relevance, and it's entirely reasonable to mix up which data is used in your system. The labelling manual doesn't know, exactly what grade of raw materials your company might be purchasing. So, it's all a little bit generic and best guess. So, if you have supplier data to suggest that your classification is different from the labelling manual, it's perfectly reasonable to use that too. Transport hazards. So as with the GHS hazards, there are only a few properties that need to be manually applied, and then the rest of the data is calculated. So I'm going to go back to our example of alpha methyl cinnamaldehyde, and because now the environmental pictogram has been triggered in the GHS hazards, that's also triggered an update in the labelling manual here to apply the class 9 miscellaneous transport hazards. So here we see there's an X because the transport has changed. and it's changed to UN 3082 Class 9 Packing Group 3. So here we need to set the property trans PG, which is the packing group, set to 3, trans CLS, which is the transport class, to 9, and trans ID, the transport ID, UN 3082. It's very important to include the UN in this property, otherwise the other properties that are calculated from these values will not calculate properly. So let's have a look at the transport hazards. So we need to add trans PG, and that has a value of 3, which is III. Trans class, which is 9. And trans ID, that's UN 3082. Okay, if I then do calculate now again, we see that a whole bunch of other properties are calculated. So we now have a proper shipping name of environmentally hazardous substance, liquid NOS, and some other properties, most of which have calculated with no value. Okay, then we can save our changes. So it's also possible for Formpak to import this data on your behalf using a CAS matching process. So many of you will be familiar with this. We use it for importing IFRA data, allergen data, as well as labelling manual, any other data that may be available. So we can import the GHS and transport data from the labelling manual for chemicals and natural complex substances into your system. So the basic process is that we would export a raw material list from the user system. We would match the CAS numbers of those raw materials against the CAS numbers in the labelling manual reference data that we're creating. Then we check that the outputs of the matching look sensible and remove any duplicates. And this is because some CAS numbers, for example, 8028486, applies to orange peel oil as well as orange essence oil, orange flower oil. And so we don't necessarily want to import orange flower oil data onto orange peel oil. So we need to remove any duplicate matches. And then this data is imported with the GHS and transport properties, and it's just the manual ones that that I added, and then the calculations take care of all of the others. So the composition of natural complex substances in tab 3, it isn't possible for Formpak to update the compositions via import unless you're a user on the Plus customer model. And this is because a complete composition must be imported rather than a single component. And if we were to import a full composition, it may disrupt any existing accumulator setup. So, for example, if you've got the allergen setup or IFRA, they're inevitably going to have accumulators, and these accumulators don't appear in the labeling manual data. So it isn't possible for us to import a composition without disrupting all of that existing data. So there is a charge for the CAS matching process, and it's estimated that it will take about 4 to 6 chargeable hours for Formpak to perform this. And you just need to bear in mind that doing the manual updates on a Formpak system with the changes in the labeling manual may take an experienced user around 40 hours. So I've done this many times in the past for the fragrance houses for which I've worked, and you know it takes about a week of solid work to get this manually updated. So let's have a look at updating the composition. So we're going to have a look at an example here of clove bud oil that's in sheet 3. So here we see the entries for clove bud oil. So it isn't really apparent just looking at that what's changed, if anything. There's no change indicators, so that's telling us that the components here haven't changed classification, but we don't necessarily know whether any of these component amounts have changed. One thing that's possible to do is something like this. So what I've done is I've copied all of the 2023 labeling manual data into one tab of a new spreadsheet, and the composition data from 2023 into another, and I've highlighted them with different colors just to easily see which tab you're on. And so if we change the filter and just look for clove bud in both, then we can see the differences by swapping tabs. So we can see that beta caryophyllene and all these others below it, they're looking very similar in amount. So they haven't changed. However, in the 2022 labeling manual, there was 4-allyl phenol at 0.2, which is no longer represented in the 2023 labeling manual sheet. So I'm going to remove that component from my clove bud oil raw material. And this is done via modify a raw material composition. So here we see the components that we're not changing. They haven't changed from 22 to 23. Here we see that we have an allergen accumulator representing clove oil at 100 parts. And this sort of thing is the reason why we can't just import a whole new composition for users. And this is the item that was in the labeling manual 2022 that's no longer in 2023. So using these buttons up here, you see we have add, we have insert, we have delete. So I'm going to delete the component from here. I'm then going to save and check in. Preserve when exploding is set to no. There's only very rare cases where there's no existing composition and you're applying a non-hazardous accumulator where you use preserve and exploding yes. So in the case of all of these natural complex substance compositions, the correct value is no. It should be borne in mind that changing the composition of a natural complex substance may well impact the GHS classification of the oil as well. So I'm just going to take a quick look at the GHS hazards here and calculate now just to see if anything changes. That doesn't appear to have changed anything in this instance. So it's probably advisable to update the compositions before you then look at the GHS properties, because you may well undo the work you've done on your GHS properties by changing the composition. So here we see a screenshot where we've got 4-allyl phenol in the before picture, and then it's removed in the after. When changing compositions, it's important to use save and check in. There is an interim save option, and this doesn't finalize the changes. So in order for the natural complex substance to be used in any mixtures, it needs to have save and check in to properly allow its use. There's more information in the support center about updating raw material compositions, and there's also the poster available for download. So let's just have a quick look at that. So I click home on the Formpak page, and that displays the support center. So here we can see then that there's training plans. And there's a training plan for adding and managing raw materials with videos to watch, presentations, and support content articles. And also by clicking downloads, we can download the GHS poster, which will be useful for converting labeling manual speak into Formpak properties. Plus customers. So some users are on a plus model of Formpak, and those users pay a premium for Formpak to manage a set of raw materials. And as such, Formpak annually updates the GHS and transport data from the latest labeling manual with no additional charge at a mutually agreed date and time. So also, in addition to that, the natural complex substance composition data will be updated, as Formpak will just import the new items rather than importing a new composition. So some of the data that's not included in either import, either if you're a plus customer and get the items imported, or if you're not a plus customer and have the and you go for the data import. The data import does not include any reach numbers, as these are specific to the supply chain, and it's up to you whether you want to import the flashpoints from the labeling manual. Some people have their own flashpoint data, and because flashpoints are quite variable in terms of the grade of material that's being specifically purchased. So unfortunately, if you are an existing customer who's not on the managed data model, so you're not a plus variant, it isn't possible to switch, as it's kind of the same reason why we can't automate the composition update. The managed items need to be added at the implementation stage and can't be added after you have existing items and data, because there won't be any link formed between them. So a few final thoughts. So the cover letter sent with the Labelling Manual 2023 includes the statement, in line with established practice, after the publication of the manual, the membership is encouraged to implement the new or modified classifications within 6 months. So whilst there's no legal obligation to use labelling manual data, the fact that you have data and intend to use it, you should probably get it done within 6 months. So this equates to July the 10th this year. If you didn't update your Formpak system with Labelling Manual 2022 data, then the GHS and transport changes in 2023 may not reflect all of the changes in your system, in which case you may want to review the entire sheet, not just the ones with the change indicators. And note that changes to raw material GHS hazards will inevitably lead to formulation classification changes, and this will in turn trigger resupply of safety data sheets. But also changes to composition may impact allergen declarations and IFRA certificates, because if, for example, a natural complex substance has a different value of an IFRA restricted component, then the overall IFRA limit may go up or down.